Something was wrong with the forest. That was the first thought that hit the men when their machetes parted the final curtain of vines and exposed the clearing. The Amazon was never silent, never. Its air normally vibrated with a constant chorus of clicks, croaks, wings, and whispers. But the place before them was swallowed by an unnatural stillness, a heavy, breathless hush that seemed to crush sound itself. Even wind, which had followed them for days, refused to stir the towering ceiba trees, rising like silent giants above the abandoned village. The men felt it in their bones. Something had happened here. Something that had ended an entire people in the span of a single night. Welcome, viewers, to a journey into one of the Amazon's most unsettling mysteries, the lost tribes who vanished without a trace. Today we begin a story buried beneath centuries of vines and shadows, a story that twists through the forgotten corners of the rainforest, where entire communities once thrived and then evaporated as if the earth swallowed them whole. Before we continue, I kindly invite you to subscribe so you don't miss the chapters ahead. Your support helps this channel bring these dark historical tales to life. If you enjoy this story, consider subscribing. The village looked as though it had been deserted only hours earlier. Fresh footprints marked the muddy soil, some small, some belonging to hunters, some to elders leaning on walking sticks. Pots still hung above dying fires. Carved wooden tools lay scattered beside woven baskets left half-filled with cassava. A hammock swayed gently, stirred not by wind, but by the passing of the explorers themselves. Everything told the same chilling story. They had been here, alive, busy with the rhythm of day-to-day life, and then something had made them vanish between one breath and the next. The lead explorer, a man hardened by years of crossing uncharted territory, felt an instinctual warning radiate through him. He had walked into tribal villages before. Some were welcoming, others tense, but always alive with the unmistakable signs of human presence. Here, it felt as though the forest itself had leaned in and silenced everything. Even animals avoided the space. Not a feather, not a print of a jaguar, not the winding trail of a python disturbed the earth. The clearing might as well have been carved into the jungle moments ago by invisible hands. Their guide, an elder from a neighboring tribe, refused to step inside. He stood at the edge of the clearing trembling, clutching a talisman against his chest. In his language, he muttered fearful warnings about places the forest takes back, and people who walk into the trees and do not return. Though the men dismissed his words as superstition, the way he refused to lift his eyes from the ground shook something old and instinctive inside them. As the explorers moved deeper into the village, one man found a small wooden carving left on a stone platform at the center of a roundhouse. It was meticulously shaped, a figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, arms stretched upward as if pleading or calling to something unseen. It had been placed carefully, intentionally, as if it held meaning, maybe even a warning. Beside it lay a single footprint, partially filled with rainwater. The footprint was unmistakably fresh, yet no body, no trail, no blood, no signs of struggle followed it. It simply ended. The surrounding forest was dense, so dense it felt like a wall of green darkness. Vines draped from branches like snakes. The canopy towered so high that sunlight barely touched the ground, creating pockets of mist that swirled in slow, ghost-like movements. Anyone leaving the village should have left traces: snapped branches, crushed leaves, broken ferns, footprints fading into the undergrowth. But every trail cut off abruptly, as though the people had walked to the edge of the clearing and dissolved into thin air. There were theories. Some believed disease had struck them quickly, too quickly. Epidemics had, in the past, wiped out entire tribes within weeks after contact with outsiders. But disease left bodies. Disease left a scatter of belongings, a sense of desperation, attempts at burial or escape. None of that existed here. Everything was preserved in a haunting pause, as though the day had been interrupted by something so sudden and absolute that no one had time to react. Others suggested the tribe might have fled in fear. Perhaps an enemy tribe attacked, but there were no battle marks, no burned huts, no spears or arrows embedded in the walls, no signs of panic or hasty departure. The baskets were not overturned, food was not scattered, and years-old treasured items were not taken. Indigenous people, no matter how urgent their flight, never abandoned sacred objects or family heirlooms. Yet here they were, untouched and waiting. A third theory, one whispered only by the region's deepest forest tribes, spoke of the spirits that swallow villages whole. Elders warned of places the trees avoided, where shadows carried memories of those who once lived there, where ancient energies pulsed beneath the soil. They told stories of invisible forces that crept through the rainforest at night, taking the living one by one. To many tribal groups, the rainforest was alive, truly alive, capable of consuming those who disturbed its balance. Still, the explorers found no evidence of supernatural involvement, nothing to confirm myth or legend. But as they searched, the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. Some men began to feel watched. They felt eyes on them from the canopy, from behind tree trunks, from the dense fern beds, and yet every time they turned, nothing moved. Only the vines seemed to shift, curling slightly as if reacting to their presence. When night came, the jungle grew impossibly dark. They lit torches, but the flames felt dull, swallowed by the dense humidity. Normally, nighttime in the Amazon was deafening, filled with nocturnal creatures beginning their hunts. But here, the quiet persisted. It pressed into their skulls and echoed in the hollows of their chests. The silence became so loud that they struggled to sleep. A few claimed they heard slow, rhythmic footsteps circling the campsite, though no prints appeared in the morning. At dawn, one man found something unusual near the edge of the clearing, a long braid of human hair hanging from a tree branch, perfectly intact, not weathered or decayed. It swung gently, though the air was still. Beneath it lay a cluster of broken clay figures, all with their faces shattered. The discovery unsettled him deeply, for it did not resemble any ritual he knew. It felt symbolic, deliberate, like someone had left a message too cryptic to understand. The deeper they searched, the more they sensed they were trespassing into a story not meant for outsiders. The ground felt softer, as though disturbed by something beneath. The trees seemed older than the rest of the forest, their bark carved with faint markings that resembled shapes of the sun, spirals and jagged lines. No one could decipher them, yet their placement felt intentional, as if marking territory or warning of something sacred. By the third day, the explorers were on edge. They had found nothing. No bodies, no trails, no sign of where the villagers went. It was as if they had evaporated. But on the final morning, something happened that chilled every man to his marrow. A single footprint appeared overnight in the center of the village, smooth, fresh, perfectly shaped, belonging to someone who had stepped there only hours earlier. But the print was too small. It belonged to a child, and there were no child prints anywhere else. The footprint pointed directly toward the forest. When they followed the direction, they found a narrow gap between two trees, almost invisible except for the impression that something had recently brushed against the bark. Beyond the gap, the jungle thickened so drastically that no sunlight passed through. It looked like a tunnel of darkness carved into the wild. The guide called it the path of no return, begging them not to go near it. Something in that moment made the group freeze. They felt as though the forest itself waited for them to take one more step. None did. They left the village that day, shaken and hollow, taking with them only the memory of the silent clearing and the single, impossible footprint. But long after they left, the forest remained unchanged. The birds did not return. The air did not lighten. The huts stood as though their owners might walk back into them at any moment, yet no one ever did. And deep within the darkness between those two trees, something watched the explorers retreat. Something that had been there when the tribe vanished, and that would be there long after others came searching. This was only one village, one disappearance among many, a tiny piece of a vast puzzle stretching across centuries and hidden beneath millions of leaves. The Amazon held far more secrets, and the next village would reveal even stranger traces of the tribes who vanished into its endless green heart. The forest had taken them somewhere, but the question remained, where? The Amazon has always been a place of abundance. Endless rivers twisting like silver serpents, towering trees that breathe clouds into the sky, and layers of life stacked upon life until the forest itself seems to pulse with its own heartbeat. But beneath that overwhelming beauty lies a quieter truth, one that has haunted explorers, historians, and tribes alike. There are places in the rainforest where people vanish without explanation, where entire communities seem to dissolve into the trees, leaving behind nothing except faint echoes of their existence. These are the places where the forest whispers. Long before the abandoned village from the first chapter was ever discovered, other tribes living near the deep interior of the Amazon spoke of a people who existed beyond the known world. They described these unseen neighbors with a mixture of fear and reverence, calling them the ones who walked between the leaves, or the Shadowfoot people. These tribes rarely offered details. When asked, they would lower their voices, their eyes shifting nervously to the canopy as though speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. The stories suggested that these lost tribes were not merely hidden, they were watching, always watching, seen only when they wished to be. Centuries ago, early missionaries traveling through the rainforest recorded strange encounters. They documented glimpses of distant figures who vanished before any contact could be made. They wrote about abandoned hunting tools in freshly woven baskets found in places where no villages existed on any map. They described hearing laughter drifting through the trees, followed by sudden silence. When they attempted to follow these traces, they never found the makers. And yet, each artifact, each footprint, each echo of presence suggested that someone, or many someones, lived in the darkened folds of the forest, remaining just close enough to be sensed but never seen. Over time, the stories collected into a kind of folklore. Elders from various tribes told of mysterious groups that moved silently through the thick canopy, appearing like shadows at the edge of fires. Sometimes they left gifts, bundles of fruit, medicinal plants, carved amulets. Other times, signs appeared that warned others away. A rope of woven vines stretched across a trail, animal bones arranged in spirals on the ground, red markings painted on tree trunks that glowed in the moonlight. These warnings were always clear and always respected. No tribe wished to anger the ones they believed lived deeper than human footsteps could go. As rubber merchants, loggers, and explorers pushed the boundaries of the mapped Amazon during the 1800s, they brought back stories of their own. Men clearing new routes through the forest swore they saw painted faces staring at them from high branches, vanished in the blink of an eye. Others claimed they heard footsteps beside them while traveling alone at night, though no human or animal left prints beside theirs. There were reports of entire camps waking to find their belongings rearranged, tools missing and replaced by unfamiliar artifacts carved with swirling patterns that no known tribe recognized. It was during this era that the first documented disappearances occurred. A small team of explorers, determined to push beyond the boundaries known to Western cartographers, vanished without leaving a single clue. Their campsite was found days later, perfectly intact. Tools laid neatly on a cloth, journals left open as though they had stepped away for only a moment, food half prepared, but not a soul remained. Their footprints stopped just a few meters from the camp, ending abruptly as though they had stepped off the earth itself.
In the years that followed, more groups vanished in similar ways. Missionaries disappeared after hearing chanting from deeper in the forest. Loggers vanished after ignoring warnings painted onto tree trunks. Even armed surveyors, confident in their maps and equipment, simply failed to return from designated routes. But what made these disappearances all the more unsettling was that none showed signs of conflict. Camps were undisturbed, supplies untouched, no broken branches, no blood, no evidence of ambush or animal attack, only a profound, eerie silence that replaced every sign of human life. Among indigenous communities, these vanishings were not surprising. They believed the forest had a mind of its own, a spirit that protected its deepest secrets. According to tribal lore, some groups lived in symbiosis with the forest so completely that they mastered its invisibility. They could move without disturbing leaves, climb without breaking branches, walk across mud without leaving prints. It was said that such tribes had rituals binding them to the forest, granting them knowledge of hidden paths, camouflages made from fermented tree sap, and ways of blending into vegetation until they were indistinguishable from it. Whether these tales were symbolic or literal, they carried weight. One legend, shared by multiple tribes across vast distances, spoke of a group known only as the ones who returned to the green. They were believed to have once been a powerful tribe, large and influential, until they committed a forbidden act, cutting sacred trees or hunting protected animals. As punishment, the forest took them back, absorbing them into its essence.
Elders said they became spirits, half human and half leaf, forever moving between the branches. Those who saw them did not see people, but shifting shadows shaped like humans. Anthropologists who collected these legends tried to interpret them in rational terms. They suggested that these tales pointed to tribes that avoided contact with outsiders or were displaced deep into the interior during periods of upheaval. But oral histories remained consistent across vastly separated groups, a rarity in Amazonian storytelling. Whether factual or symbolic, the legends hinted at something ancient, something older than the tribes, older than the forest paths, older than memory itself. Another recurring myth described a place where trees whispered warnings. Travelers claimed to hear voices drifting from the canopy, speaking languages they did not recognize. These whispers grew louder the deeper one walked, becoming almost like chants or low humming vibrations. Many believed the whispers were messages from lost tribes, cautioning outsiders to leave. Others thought they were echoes of those who had disappeared, trapped between worlds. A few believed it was the forest itself, speaking through its leaves and vines. When modern researchers began studying these reports, they found something curious. Areas associated with the whispering phenomenon often overlapped with regions where disappearances occurred. These locations tended to be near uncharted rivers, around collapsed sinkholes, or within ancient groves where the trees were so dense they formed natural tunnels. Sound behaved strangely in such places. Echoes lingered, carrying murmurs and distortions that sounded almost like voices. Whether natural or supernatural, the result was the same. Travelers often fled. One researcher recorded an experience where, deep in the forest, he heard what sounded like a child laughing. The sound floated from one direction, then another, then directly behind him. When he spun around, he found nothing but damp leaves. Moments later, he heard his own name spoken softly. But he was alone. No other team member was nearby. When he returned to camp, he discovered no one had called his name at all. His account was dismissed as auditory hallucination, but the recordings he captured revealed faint whispers that experts could not explain. For the tribes living closest to these mysterious regions, there was no confusion about the source. They insisted the lost tribes tended to move in these shadowed spaces, unseen but ever present. Some believed these tribes had developed ways to erase their presence after witnessing centuries of violence brought by outsiders. Others thought they lived on the boundary between this world and another, stepping in and out of existence like flickering flames.
What united all these tales was a single shared belief. No one disappeared without reason. The forest did not take people arbitrarily, it chose. And those who vanished were either taken by those who lived deeper than maps could reach, or absorbed by the forest's ancient will. As explorers, settlers, and anthropologists pressed farther into the unknown, they encountered the same haunting signs: abandoned tools, empty huts, and footprints that ended in the middle of trails. With every new discovery, one truth became harder to ignore. The forest was not merely vast, it was intentional. It hid things with purpose. It concealed stories older than civilizations. And somewhere within its endless depths, tribes walked along paths no outsider had ever seen. The deeper the world looked into the Amazon, the more it found that its mysteries only grew. The forest whispered, and those who listened too closely often joined the chorus, never to return. For centuries, the far interior of the Amazon had been a blank space on maps, an emerald void stretching endlessly toward the horizon, swallowing rivers, mountains, and entire civilizations. But even in the uncharted heart of the rainforest, some mysteries were spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. Among them was the legend of the tribe of the Red Smoke, a people known only by the strange crimson clouds that drifted above their hidden homeland. No one had ever seen the tribe clearly. No faces, no rituals, no language had ever been observed. Only that eerie, hovering smoke signaled their presence, rising into the air like a blood-red beacon. The first written record of the Red Smoke came from a Portuguese explorer in the early 1700s. He described approaching a remote valley while navigating a labyrinth of narrow rivers. At twilight, he saw a vibrant red plume spiraling into the sky. Not a natural shade like a sunset, but a vivid, burning crimson that seemed to glow against the fading light. It rose steadily from behind the tree line, solid and unwavering, as though produced by a carefully controlled fire. He and his men attempted to reach the source, but as night fell, the forest changed around them. Trails shifted, sounds echoed strangely, making it impossible to determine direction. They eventually turned back, claiming the forest itself refused to let them pass. In the decades that followed, traders, hunters, and missionaries would occasionally catch sight of the same crimson plumes from great distances. Whenever the red smoke appeared, the surrounding tribes reacted with dread. Some said it meant the forest was being fed. Others claimed it signaled the tribe's rituals, rituals that few could describe and none dared to witness. A handful believed it was a warning, something meant to keep outsiders away. An elder from another tribe once whispered, "The red smoke marked the breathing of the earth's oldest children," though he refused to explain further. The stories grew stranger with time. During the rubber boom of the late 1800s, a crew of workers reported seeing the red smoke rise 3 days in a row from the same distant peak. On the 4th day, they decided to investigate. They traveled for hours through dense undergrowth, hacked through walls of vines, and crossed dangerous streams where the water ran black. At last, they reached the hilltop from which the plume had appeared. There was no sign of fire. No ashes, no scorched earth. The clearing was cool and undisturbed, covered in fresh green leaves. It was as though the smoke had never existed at all. And yet, while the men stood there, they felt a strange heat radiating from the ground, as if embers still glowed beneath the soil. One man swore he heard faint chanting carried on the wind, but no one else heard it.
Another insisted that the trees around them were arranged unnaturally, as if bent or twisted by unknown hands. The group left quickly, feeling as though invisible eyes followed them back into the foliage. When they returned to camp, they discovered that the red smoke had risen again, this time behind them. By the early 1900s, sightings of the mysterious smoke began to decline, though they never vanished entirely. Explorers who ventured deeper into uncharted territory reported finding red pigment smeared across tree trunks and stones. This pigment was unlike the natural dyes used by known tribes. It shimmered faintly, almost metallic, and resisted rainwater as though infused with oil. Some samples tested by researchers decades later revealed no known botanical or mineral source. The origin of the substance remained a puzzle, fueling theories that the lost tribe had developed a method of producing pigments from rare plants that modern science had yet to identify. One anthropologist in the 1920s made one of the most fascinating discoveries. While on expedition, he came across a set of stone bowls arranged at the top of a ridge. Each bowl held a hardened residue of dark red powder, almost like a dye or incense. When he scraped a small amount into a vial for analysis, the powder emitted a sharp, sweet scent that lingered for hours. Moments later, his guide begged him to leave the area immediately. The guide insisted that the powder belonged to the Red Smoke people and that removing it would anger them. That night, something disturbed the camp. The anthropologist wrote in his journal that he heard footsteps circling their tents, soft and rhythmic. Leaves rustled, but no shadows moved. At dawn, the red powder he had collected was gone from his vial. The glass was left unbroken. The stopper was still sealed, yet the powder had vanished entirely. His guide claimed that the forest had reclaimed what belonged to the tribe. The anthropologist tried to rationalize it, but the feeling of unease lingered for the rest of his expedition.
As time passed, each new expedition into the region added pieces to the growing mystery. Some explorers claimed to find sections of forest where the air was unusually warm, even during the rainy season. Others reported discovering trees with trunks stained deep red, though no source of the pigment could be found nearby. Theories flourished. Some believed the tribe used a unique mixture of crushed seeds, tree bark, and minerals to produce smoke signals visible for miles. Others suggested the pigment was symbolic of a spiritual or ritualistic practice. But what made the legend far more chilling was the story of the final disappearance associated with the red smoke. In 1933, a group of 6 men journeyed deep into the central Amazon, following a rumor from local tribes that the red smoke had returned after nearly 2 decades of silence. The men were seasoned explorers, confident in their ability to handle the dangers of the rainforest. For days they traveled through dense vegetation, crossing rivers filled with hidden currents and sleeping under canopies alive with insects and distant animal calls. On the 9th day, they saw it, a thin column of red rising through the trees, steady and vibrant, as though painted onto the sky. They approached cautiously, taking note of the strange warmth in the air. By sunset, they arrived at the ridge where the smoke had originated. But just like the stories before, they found nothing. No ash, no fire, no signs of ritual activity, only untouched earth. However, this time there was something new. A series of small footprints leading away from the ridge, heading into an impossibly thick grove of trees. The footprints were delicate, spaced unevenly, and appeared to belong to children. They were fresh, too fresh for comfort. The men followed them until the tracks stopped suddenly at a clearing. In the center of that clearing was a ring of stones arranged with mathematical precision. Each stone was coated in the same metallic red pigment found in earlier accounts. The air shimmered slightly above the stones, as though heated by an invisible fire.
But when one explorer reached out, the air felt cool. That night, the men camped nearby, exhausted and uneasy. As darkness settled, they heard a distant humming, like many voices blending into one. It grew louder, vibrating through the ground. Suddenly, the forest fell silent, completely, unnaturally silent. The humming ceased. A few moments later, a single burst of red light flashed over the treetops, though no sound accompanied it. When morning came, the entire group had vanished.
Weeks later, a rescue team found their camp. The tents were intact, supplies neatly arranged, tools untouched, no signs of struggle. But at the center of the abandoned site lay something that chilled everyone. 6 small mounds of red ash, each the size of a human heart. No one could explain what happened to the men. It was as if the red smoke people had risen once more to reclaim their secrets and silence those who ventured too close. In the years since, the legend has persisted, passed down through the forest like a soft breath on the wind. Some believe the tribe still survives, hidden deep in regions untouched by satellites or modern maps. Others think they no longer exist physically, but spiritually linger within the forest's folds. There are even those who suggest the tribe mastered a rare botanical concoction, able to produce smoke that disorients or hypnotizes outsiders, creating illusions that lead people astray. What remains undeniable is that the red smoke has never been explained, and although sightings have grown rare, every few decades a faint crimson plume rises somewhere in the Amazon, quickly swallowed by the sky. When it does, the surrounding tribes still fall silent, listening to the forest breathe in warning. For in the Amazon, smoke is never just smoke, and when it turns red, something ancient stirs beneath the leaves. The Amazon canopy is a world far above the ground, a kingdom of branches and drifting mist where animals move like ghosts and sunlight filters down in fractured beams. To most who travel through the rainforest, the sounds and shapes above remain mysterious, an unreachable realm where shadows glide silently from tree to tree. But for some explorers, those who spent enough time wandering the deep interior, there was an unsettling belief that the canopy did more than shelter life. It watched, and sometimes it watched with intent. Reports of this phenomenon began long before modern anthropology, long before satellite imaging, long before any attempt to chart the Amazon's endless expanse. Indigenous hunters returning from long expeditions often spoke of the sensation of being observed from above. They described an uncanny feeling that eyes followed them, eyes that shifted with their every step, hidden behind layers of leaves so dense they created permanent twilight. These hunters would rarely look upward, for their elders had warned them that the watchers did not like to be seen. It was said that those who searched for the watchers sometimes never returned.
The stories spread among tribes separated by vast rivers and mountains, tribes with no shared language or customs. Yet the tales were almost identical. People claimed they saw flashes of movement far overhead, human-like forms perched on branches too thin to support their weight, faces painted so dark they blended with the shadows, bodies so lean they looked carved from smoke. These sightings were always brief, lasting only the heartbeat between perception and doubt. But their consistency suggested something real moved above the forest floor, something that preferred the canopy to the earth. By the 19th century, as Western explorers ventured deeper into the Amazon, they too reported unsettling encounters. A naturalist traveling near the Rio Jutai documented moments where he heard branches shifting directly overhead, though the canopy was too thick to reveal the source. At night, while his camp slept, he claimed to hear soft, rhythmic tapping from high in the trees, a sound that moved slowly in circles around their tents. When he climbed a tall ceiba tree one morning to investigate, he found thin vines braided into loops and knots that resembled handholds or footholds, as though someone had crafted a hidden pathway through the treetops.
The vines were fresh, recently used, yet there were no signs of habitation on the forest floor below. Even more disturbing were the stories from explorers who traveled during the rubber boom. Men working for harvesting companies described seeing figures quickly withdraw behind branches the moment they looked up. One man recalled spotting what he thought was a child perched on a branch, its limbs long and its skin smeared with dark pigment. When he blinked, the figure was gone, but the branch, thick as it was, still swayed as though it had only just been occupied. Although he dismissed the sighting as exhaustion or imagination, others in his crew saw similar shapes on different days, always just out of focus, always vanishing too quickly to follow. Some researchers theorized that unknown tribes had mastered arboreal movement in ways modern humans had not. They might have used natural ropes, modified the branches, or trained their bodies from childhood to navigate the forest canopy as fluidly as monkeys or birds. However, no physical evidence of such tribes was found on the ground. No villages, no fire pits, no tools, no discarded materials. It was as if an entire culture existed purely in the heights, leaving no trace among the leaf litter and soil.
But the indigenous explanations were far more unsettling. Elders from distant tribes shared stories of a people who lived, quote, above the breath of the earth, a tribe that refused to let their feet touch the ground. These watchers, they said, had once lived like all others, but after something unspeakable happened, a great sickness, a betrayal, or a long war, they abandoned the earth and took to the trees for survival. Over time, they changed. Their bodies grew lighter, their limbs lengthened, their faces grew sharp, and their eyes adapted to the filtered twilight of the canopy. They lived in silence, communicating with soft clicks and hums that blended with sounds of insects. They viewed those on the ground with suspicion, sometimes with interest, but never with trust. Elders claimed that these watchers no longer considered themselves part of the human world. They were the forest's sentinels, warning their hidden communities of danger. They had seen what outsiders did: deforestation, violence, exploitation, and so they retreated upward, leaving behind only shadows and whispers for those below. In the early 20th century, one of the most detailed and chilling accounts came from a cartographer mapping an unnamed tributary of the Amazon. For weeks, he and his small team traveled through terrain untouched by modern civilization. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the cartographer began noticing subtle changes in the environment. Branches overhead seemed to have unusual bends, as if shaped by repeated use. Large leaves showed signs of being folded or trimmed. More unsettlingly, there were moments when he felt something shift above him, like a person moving their weight from one branch to another. Yet he never saw anything clearly. It wasn't until the 15th day that he experienced what he later described as the most terrifying moment of his life. While resting near a fallen tree, he glanced upward and saw a pair of eyes staring directly at him from the canopy. They were wide, dark, and unblinking, framed by a narrow face painted in a pattern of black stripes. The eyes held no curiosity, no malice, only an intense, silent awareness. When he gasped, the figure tilted its head slightly, as though studying him. Then, with unimaginable speed, it vanished behind a cluster of leaves. That night, he could feel dozens of eyes watching from above. The team considered turning back, but they felt compelled to continue, driven by the need to understand who or what shared the canopy with them. However, the forest grew more hostile. Their belongings were tampered with while they slept. Food disappeared. Small, sharpened sticks were arranged around their tents in patterns that resembled warnings. On the 18th night, one member of the group woke to the sound of something landing silently near his hammock. He found no one there, but his hammock rope had been cut clean through, as though with a blade made of stone or bone. On the 20th day, the cartographer awoke alone. His team had vanished. Their tents remained undisturbed, their tools neatly arranged.
Footprints led nowhere. Shadows danced overhead, but he saw no faces, no figures, only the faintest rustle of leaves. Terrified, he fled and never returned to the region. He later wrote that the forest that day felt more alive than anything he had ever known, as if it had lungs, as if it breathed him out. What made his account particularly haunting was the discovery made years later by a different expedition: woven platforms high in the trees, nearly invisible from the ground, interconnected by thick branches and vines. These platforms were shaped like nests or sleeping areas. They were too large for animals, too carefully arranged, too deliberate, and from one platform, explorers recovered a fragment of pigment-stained material, possibly cloth or bark, marked with a black geometric pattern reminiscent of a human face. Yet no tribe claimed these structures, and shortly after their discovery, the platforms disappeared, vines cut, branches broken, remnants scattered. It was as if their makers knew they had been found and erased the evidence with precision and speed. Modern theories now suggest the Watchers could be descendants of uncontacted tribes forced into hiding, perfecting invisibility as a survival method. But others believe something older, more mysterious survives above the rainforest floor. A people who learned to live where no one else dared, whose eyes still follow those who wander too far into the unknown. And for anyone who has ever slept beneath the Amazon canopy, the feeling of being watched is not imagination, it is memory, one the forest keeps alive with every rustle, every shift of shadow, every soft click from the branches above. The Amazon River is often described as the world's living artery, an endless, winding force that pulses through the rainforest like a great serpent. It nourishes everything it touches. Villages are born along its banks, civilizations rise and fall beside its currents. But there are places along this river and its countless unnamed tributaries where life retreats and the water feels wrong, where even the birds refuse to fly low and the monkeys abandon the canopy overhanging the banks. These are the places whispered about by the tribes, where the river carries not just water, but memories of those who disappeared into its depths. One of the most unsettling of these places is a long-forgotten tributary that explorers later called the River of Silent Bones. The name did not come from bodies floating on the surface. There were no skeletons jutting from the muddy banks. Instead, the name came from a haunting discovery made by a group of river merchants in the late 1800s. The men had been traveling for days, pushing their small wooden boat deeper into uncharted territory in search of new trade routes. The river grew narrower, the water darker, its edges lined with twisted roots that resembled skeletal fingers reaching out from the banks. One morning, as the mist lifted from the water, they noticed something pale glimmering beneath the surface. At first, they assumed it was driftwood bleached by the sun, but as the boat drifted closer, they realized the pale shapes were not wood. They were bones. The bones were arranged in strange patterns along the riverbed, spirals, circles, long parallel lines that followed the river's flow. Some were animal bones, but others were unmistakably human. Their placement was too deliberate, too organized to be the work of nature. Even the currents, normally relentless in reshaping the landscape, seemed to avoid disturbing these formations. It was as though the river itself respected them. The merchants, unnerved but curious, collected several bones to take back to their village. But something strange happened. That night, as they camped along the riverbank, they heard faint splashes in the water. Slow, steady movements, as though someone were walking through the shallow edges. But when they shined their lanterns across the surface, nothing stirred. The splashing continued, circling their camp, always out of view, always just distant enough to provoke fear. By dawn, the bones they had collected were gone from their bags. The bags were untorn, the knots had not been loosened, yet the bones had simply vanished.
In their place were small piles of wet river mud shaped into spirals matching those they had seen on the river bed. The merchants fled at first light, leaving their supplies behind. They later insisted that the river had taken back what belonged to it, erasing the evidence as though protecting a secret. Years later, more ominous stories emerged. A tribe living dozens of kilometers downstream told tales of ghostly figures drifting along the water late at night, shapes that seemed human but lacked faces. They were described as pale and silent, gliding with the current, dissolving whenever anyone tried to get too close. The elders said these were the ones who returned to the river, a lost tribe whose people vanished one generation at a time until none remained. According to legend, the river called them back, reclaiming their bodies and memories. Those who tried to leave were hunted by the river's shadowy spirits.
But the origins of the River of Silent Bones grew more complicated when researchers later uncovered partial journals belonging to a 1904 expedition that disappeared in the same region. The journals told of a tribe known as the Yaru, a group deeply connected to the river. The Yaru believed the river was not just a source of life, it was a living entity with desires, moods, and demands. Every year, the tribe performed rituals along the water's edge, offering food, carvings, and occasionally blood sacrifices drawn from their own limbs to appease the river's hunger. Then, one year, the river stopped accepting their offerings. The water levels dropped unnaturally, and fish vanished from entire stretches. The elders interpreted this as the river's anger. They feared a punishment far greater than drought, and so they prepared the ultimate offering. The journals suggested that the Yaru gathered as a whole group, men, women, elders, and children, and walked into the river one dusk, chanting as they went. They disappeared beneath the surface without a struggle, their bodies carried downstream. The next day, according to the journals, the river rose again, swollen and restless. The water turned murky for weeks, then cleared suddenly, as though the river had swallowed every trace of the tribe. Of course, these journals were never verified. The expedition vanished before the story could be told in full, leaving behind only fragments. But decades later, when a team of archaeologists returned to the region, they made discoveries that supported at least part of the story. They found stone carvings buried along the riverbank, faces elongated into tear-shaped forms, eyes wide with fear, mouths stretched open in silent screams. The stones were arranged in a long line that resembled a procession of figures walking toward the water. The archaeologists also found shards of ancient pottery decorated with swirling patterns, eerily similar to the spirals of bones seen beneath the river. These spirals repeated across carvings of fish and river serpents, each shaped with precise curves. Some believed the spirals represented currents or whirlpools. Others thought they symbolized a connection between life and death. But every interpretation pointed toward one idea: the river held power over life. The most chilling discovery came during a dive survey conducted decades later. Divers exploring the deepest part of the tributary found not only more bones, but also structures. Pillars of stone arranged in rows beneath the water, worn by time but unmistakably crafted by human hands. These underwater monoliths suggested the existence of a settlement that had once stood where the river now flowed. It was as though the river had consumed an entire village, drowning it and burying its memory beneath the surface.
One diver reported seeing something even more disturbing. He claimed he saw movement among the bones, shapes twisting and shifting in the water, too slow to be fish, too smooth to be debris. They moved with purpose, he said, as though aware of his presence. When he surfaced, he was shaking uncontrollably. He refused to dive again and insisted the riverbed was not empty. Something lived there. Local tribes later warned explorers to avoid the region entirely. They said the Yapuru, or whatever remained of them, still walked beneath the water, bound to the river's will. They claimed the bones formed messages, patterns meant to keep outsiders away. Anyone who disrupted the bones or tried to take them would be followed, not by spirits, but by something far worse. They spoke of shadows rising from the river at night, leaving footprints of wet mud that led into the forest, but never out. Even today, the River of Silent Bones remains largely unexplored. Satellite images show nothing unusual. Maps mark it as just another tributary among thousands, but those who live nearby refuse to travel its length. Fishermen avoid its waters. Hunters do not follow prey into its territory. The forest around it grows thicker than elsewhere, as though guarding the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beneath. Some say the river still carries the whispers of the tribe that vanished, faint voices humming through its currents. Others insist that the bones rearrange themselves every year, forming new patterns, new warnings. And a few believe that those who disappeared into the forest, explorers, missionaries, entire communities, may have found their final resting place there, swallowed by the same river that claimed the Yapuru. But one thing is certain: the river remembers. It remembers the footsteps of those who walked willingly into its arms. It remembers the bones of those it took, and it remembers the secrets it promised never to release. For centuries, the Amazon resisted all attempts to be fully mapped. Explorers carved paths through its green labyrinth, missionaries traced routes along its rivers, and cartographers sketched outlines of its mountains, but the forest always kept secrets. Trails vanished within weeks, villages appeared and disappeared, rivers changed course with the seasons, and entire regions remained untouched by human eyes. So when a strange map surfaced in the mid-1900s, one detailing a remote portion of the rainforest that no expedition had ever charted, it immediately drew suspicion, fear, and fascination. The map was found in the belongings of a deceased rubber merchant who had lived alone near the Peruvian border. Among his faded journals and cracked tools, researchers discovered a thin, weather-worn sheet of parchment. It was unlike any map of the time. The parchment showed no political borders, no known rivers, and no recognizable landmarks. Instead, it depicted strange symbols carved into the surface with almost obsessive precision. At the center of the map was a single shape, a settlement marked by concentric circles surrounded by intricate patterns that resembled vines, spirals, and something that looked like animal tracks.
Most puzzling of all was the label written in a language no one recognized. The symbols bore some resemblance to ancient tribal scripts, but none matched any known Amazonian dialect. Linguists speculated that it was either a lost tribal language or a coded message intended to hide the settlement's true location. No one could explain how the merchant had come to possess it. His journals were filled with vague entries, mentions of a hidden people, references to the circle that moves, and repeated notes about feeling watched during his final journey. As scholars debated its authenticity, a small team of explorers became convinced the map was genuine. Ignoring warnings from local tribes and skepticism from academic circles, they set out to find the mysterious settlement. The forest greeted them with oppressive humidity, dense fog, and a silence that felt almost alive. Days passed with no sign of the landmarks indicated on the parchment, yet the team continued, driven by a mixture of curiosity and obsession. On the sixth day, they stumbled upon something extraordinary: a row of massive stone pillars, half buried in soil and strangled by vines. Each pillar was carved with the same spirals found on the map. The carvings appeared ancient, older than any known Amazonian civilization. Some spirals were embedded so deeply into the stone that they glowed faintly under the filtered sunlight. This discovery alone would have rewritten regional history, but the team barely had time to document it before something far stranger occurred.
That night, as they camped beside the pillars, they heard soft rustling in the trees. Not the rustling of animals. This was deliberate, rhythmic, human. In the faint glow of their fire, they saw brief flashes of movement, figures slipping behind tree trunks, silhouettes perched high on branches, eyes glinting in the darkness. The explorers whispered among themselves, debating whether to call out, but their guide warned them not to. He had heard stories of forest dwellers who protected ancient sites with deadly skill, tribes whose names were never spoken aloud. The next morning, they found a new marking carved into one of the stone pillars. It was fresh, so fresh that fragments of stone dust still lay on the ground. The marking was a symbol no one recognized, but its meaning was clear. Leave.
Instead, the team pressed on. By following the spirals carved into the pillars, they discovered a narrow path almost completely hidden by dense vegetation. It was not a natural trail. Branches had been cut, roots rearranged, stones placed intentionally. Someone had created this path long ago and had maintained it well enough that the forest did not reclaim it entirely. The path wound upward through increasingly steep terrain until they reached a ridge overlooking a deep valley. There they saw it, the exact circular clearing from the map, carved into the forest floor like an enormous eye staring upward. It was perfectly symmetrical, impossibly round, and surrounded by trees that leaned outward as though pushed back by some force. The clearing appeared untouched, as if no one had walked there for centuries, and yet the air above it shimmered faintly, as though heated by an invisible flame. The explorers descended into the valley with a mix of dread and awe. The soil within the clearing was soft, almost unnaturally so, as if recently disturbed. The center held a massive stone slab covered in the same intricate patterns from the map. Beneath the slab, a hollow sound echoed when one of the explorers tapped it. Something lay beneath. As they prepared to lift the slab, the air grew heavy. Leaves trembled despite the stillness. A low humming sound filled the clearing, building slowly like the resonance of distant drums. Their guide begged them to stop, insisting they had crossed into sacred ground. But excitement overpowered caution. 4 of the explorers pushed against the slab, while the others steadied ropes and tools. The slab shifted. A crack formed along its base, and beneath it, something moved. The earth trembled as if slipping from memory. A burst of warm air surged upward, carrying a scent unlike anything they had ever smelled, sweet and pungent with an undertone of decay. The humming in the clearing intensified, echoing inside their skulls. One explorer collapsed, clutching his head. Another stumbled backward, convinced he heard whispers rising from the darkness below. Then, just as they lifted the slab enough to glimpse the hollow beneath, the forest erupted. Figures appeared around the clearing, dozens of them, silhouettes emerging from the trees with silent speed. Their bodies were lean, their skin painted in swirling patterns that matched the carvings on the slab. Their eyes were dark, unblinking, reflective like the eyes of nocturnal animals. They moved in perfect coordination, surrounding the explorers with unnerving precision. The explorers, terrified but frozen by awe, slowly dropped their tools. The figures did not attack. They only watched, their gazes heavy with warning. The humming grew louder, now clearly coming from the figures themselves, a low, resonant sound produced by their throats, vibrating through the air with almost hypnotic force. The guide, trembling, fell to his knees and covered his face. The figures shifted their attention toward him, and for a moment the humming softened. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. No leaves rustled, no branches moved. One moment the clearing was filled with watchers, the next it was empty. Only the sound of distant insects remained. The explorers fled, abandoning their gear. When they reached the ridge and looked back, the clearing was gone. The perfect circle had been replaced by dense forest, as though it had never existed at all.
The ridge, offering a clear vantage minutes earlier, now provided only an unbroken canopy. When the explorers returned to civilization, they attempted to relocate the valley. Every attempt failed. The map, once so detailed, now felt wrong. Distances didn't match. Rivers seemed to have shifted. Landmarks vanished. The parchment itself began to deteriorate rapidly, the symbols fading until nothing remained but faint impressions. To this day, the valley and the concentric settlement remain lost, hidden by the forest, or erased by something older and more powerful than mere geography. Some believe the tribe guarding it moved again, sealing its location from the world. Others think the map was never meant to be found, that it contained knowledge passed down by a tribe that could walk between shadows and reshape the forest at will. But the most unsettling theory is the simplest. The settlement still exists, waiting beneath the earth, guarded by those whose eyes watch from the canopy and whose voices hum through the trees.
There are tales in the Amazon that even the elders hesitate to repeat, stories whispered only at night when the fires burn low and the forest hums with ancient memory. Among these tales, few are as haunting as the legend of the Vanished Children of Yuma, a disappearance so profound it rippled through generations and left a wound that never fully healed. While entire tribes have vanished across the centuries, the story of Yuma stands apart because it begins with laughter, children's laughter, echoing through the river valleys before fading into silence that would last forever. The Yuma were a small, peaceful tribe known for their vibrant red and blue feather garments, their elaborate harvest festivals, and their deep reverence for the spirits they believed lived within the roots of ancient trees. They carved intricate patterns into bark, wove stories into their clothing, and believed that every person's shadow was a living entity that watched over them. Their village sat near a series of natural springs where crystal-clear water bubbled up from beneath the earth, so pure the tribes from miles away traveled to drink from it. For generations, the Yuma thrived in harmony with the forest. But everything changed on a night when the moon rose blood orange over the treetops, a night the tribe later called the Red Moon of Loss. It began quietly. As the sun dipped behind the canopy, the children of the Yuma gathered near the springs, laughing and splashing in the warm twilight. Some chased each other between the roots, others played with carved wooden animals. The adults, preparing dinner nearby, listened to the laughter and felt comforted by its melody. It was said that the laughter of Yuma children brought good fortune, a sign the spirits were pleased. But then the sound changed. One mother later said that the laughter suddenly twisted, still recognizable, but stretched, distant, as though the children's voices were drifting from deep within the forest rather than the springs. Another parent claimed the air grew colder, unnaturally so, as if the warmth had been sucked away in an instant. The adults called out, expecting the children to run back, as they always did. No one came. Alarmed, the parents rushed to the springs. The water was still. The wooden animals lay untouched. Small footprints circled the mud, but they did not lead into the forest or away from the springs. They simply stopped. Each set ended abruptly, as if the children had taken one final step and then ceased to exist.
The adults spread out, searching the forest floor, climbing trees, scanning the riverbanks. They found nothing. No path, no snapped branches, no signs of struggle, not a single clue. It was as though the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed the children whole. For the next 3 days, the Yanama searched tirelessly, refusing to sleep. They beat drums to call the spirits, burned herbs to attract the shadows of their ancestors, and offered food to the forest. But the only response was silence. The forest, usually full of life, had grown unnervingly quiet. Birds avoided the area. Even insects seemed to disappear. Only the wind moved, soft, slow, whispering through the vines like a voice too faint to understand. On the 4th day, something strange happened.
At dawn, while the adults gathered near the springs, they heard footsteps, tiny, quick, unmistakably those of children. The sound came from deep within the trees, echoing through the trunks. Hearts leapt. Parents called out, shouting the names of their sons and daughters. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The underbrush rustled. For a moment, hope blazed in every heart. But no child emerged. Instead, only the sound slipped out of the forest, footsteps pacing in circles, running, playing, sounds without bodies. They continued for nearly an hour, drifting around the village before slowly fading into silence once more. The parents collapsed in grief. The elders prayed. Then came the second loss. 3 nights after the footsteps faded, another group of children disappeared. This time, they vanished from inside the village. Parents woke to find empty hammocks, no footprints, and the same eerie silence pressing against their homes. Again, the children's laughter echoed faintly from the trees, taunting, distant, like a fading memory trapped between worlds. The tribe was consumed with fear. Elders gathered to interpret the signs, convinced the disappearance was tied to the red moon. They believed something ancient had awoken beneath the springs, something the tribe had long forgotten or accidentally angered. Some insisted the disappearing children had been taken by the root spirits, guardians of the underworld. Others believed the forest itself had claimed them, pulling them into hidden places where outsiders could not trespass. One elder, a woman whose hair had grown white long before her age, recalled a forgotten legend. She recalled a tale of a tribe that once lived near the springs, long before the Yanama. This ancient tribe had angered the forest by digging too deep into the earth, seeking the source of the spring's water. For their transgression, the forest had taken their children first, then their young adults, then their elders, until nothing remained. The tribe vanished from history, absorbed into the roots of the forest.
Her warning came too late. Within a month, the Yuma lost every child under 12. There were no bodies, no clues, no signs of what force had taken them. The spring water, once clear and beautiful, began to darken, swirling with faint traces of red. Elders declared the village cursed. Families fled in all directions, hoping to escape whatever shadow had fallen over their home. But as the Yuma scattered, more stories surfaced. Those who fled to other tribes claimed they heard their children's laughter in distant forests at night. Some said they felt small hands tugging at their clothing in darkness. Others described seeing glimpses of children darting between trees, shadows shaped like their lost sons and daughters, but moving too smoothly, too silently, as if no longer entirely human. In the decades that followed, explorers ventured into the region where the Yuma had once lived. The springs were overgrown, choked by vines and roots thicker than a man's arm. The water had turned cloudy and still. And scattered along the riverbanks, explorers found delicate carvings, tiny wooden figurines carved with exquisite detail. Each figurine had blank, wide eyes and elongated limbs. They resembled children, but not entirely. Something was off, as though the artist had attempted to depict something not quite human. Diversity in accounts increased over time. Some modern researchers theorized that a sudden landslide or sinkhole swallowed the children. Others suggested toxic gases rising from underground pockets near the springs. Still others proposed mass abduction by hostile tribes, but none of these explanations accounted for the lack of physical evidence, the strange footprints, or the repeated accounts of disembodied laughter heard decades later. Among local tribes today, the Yuma story remains a warning. Guides refuse to take visitors near the region. Hunters detour around the old grounds. At night, those living nearby claim they sometimes hear faint footsteps along the riverbanks, footsteps small and playful, vanishing the moment light pierces the darkness. And there is one final chilling detail.
A few years ago, a researcher studying acoustic anomalies in the Amazon recorded strange audio near the ruins of the Yuma village. When he played the recording back at half speed, he heard what sounded unmistakably like children laughing and whispering in a language that has not been spoken in 100 years. Some say the Yuma children were taken by the forest. Others say they became part of it. And a few whisper that they are still there, forever young, forever lost, never fully gone.
There are places in the Amazon where the forest seems to breathe differently, where the air thickens, the light dims, and even experienced guides hesitate to cross unseen boundaries. Among these mysterious regions, none is feared quite like the Forbidden Valley, a hidden basin cloaked in shadow, encircled by sheer cliffs, and long rumored to be the final home of tribes who vanished without a trace. For centuries, no one dared to venture inside. Those who tried either never returned or came back with stories that echoed nightmares rather than memories. The first recorded mention of the valley appeared in a missionary's journal in the late 1700s. While traveling with a local tribe along a remote river, he noted how the elders abruptly stopped singing as they approached a towering wall of rock. The cliffs rose so high they cut into the clouds, forming a natural barrier that shadowed the riverbed. The elders refused to speak about what lay beyond the cliff. When pressed, they told the missionary that the valley was a place the earth hides from the sun, and that its floor was inhabited by spirits who once walked the forest as flesh and bone. Curiosity stirred among European explorers for decades, but no one managed to locate the valley described in the journal. It became a ghost story, a myth hidden behind layers of fog and foliage. That changed in the early 1960s when a small reconnaissance plane flying over the Amazon recorded something strange on its aerial camera, a massive clearing shaped with unnatural symmetry. The clearing formed a perfect circle nearly half a mile wide, surrounded by dense forest so thick that even the midday sun struggled to penetrate it. The pilot, startled by the image, circled back, but the second time he passed over the coordinates, the clearing was gone. In its place stood unbroken canopy. The footage nonetheless sparked interest among researchers. A team of 6 explorers set out on foot soon after, determined to reach the coordinates recorded by the pilot. Their journey took them through some of the most treacherous terrain imaginable. Steep, muddy slopes, labyrinths of tangled vines, marsh-like forest floors that swallowed their boots, and stretches of darkness beneath the densest parts of the canopy. Many times they felt watched. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision. Nights passed without the usual chorus of insects. They felt as though the forest itself was waiting.
On the 12th day, the explorers found the base of the cliff described 2 centuries earlier. It was even more imposing in reality, an immense stone wall rising so high it disappeared into mist. The stone was smooth in some places and jagged in others, streaked with veins of black mineral that reflected faint light in unnatural ways. The team followed the cliff, searching for an entrance, until they reached a narrow crevice just wide enough for one person to slip through. The walls of the passage were covered with carvings, symbols etched with strange precision, spirals, elongated figures, suns with broken rays, and circles within circles. None resembled known tribal artwork. Beyond the crevice lay the valley. The moment they stepped inside, everything changed. The valley floor was covered in a thick layer of mist that clung stubbornly to the ground, swirling around their boots like living fog. The air was uncomfortably warm, carrying a faint metallic scent like rust or old blood. The trees inside the basin were unlike any the explorers had seen in the Amazon. Taller, darker, their trunks twisted and gnarled as though shaped by centuries of unnatural growth. Their leaves hung like wilted hands, long and narrow. And the silence was absolute. Not a single bird,
insect or animal stirred within the valley. Even the wind seemed too afraid to enter. Yet the most unsettling sight was the clearing itself. At the center of the valley, the mist thinned enough to reveal a massive circular space free of trees. The soil there was unnaturally smooth, as though something had swept it clear. Along its edges were dozens of stone monoliths arranged in a perfect ring, each carved with symbols that matched the markings on the crevice walls. The explorers approached cautiously, their senses screaming warnings they struggled to ignore. One monolith drew their attention, a tall pillar etched with deep spirals that descended from top to bottom like a coiled serpent. Its base was cracked, revealing something beneath the stone, a glimpse of darker material, almost like bone. As they examined the structure, a low hum vibrated through the ground. It wasn't loud, but the sensation was unmistakable. The earth trembled gently, sending tiny ripples through the mist. The team exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether the tremor was geological or something more sinister.
They set up camp at the valley's edge, planning to document the carvings at sunrise. But as night descended, the valley revealed its true nature. At first, the explorers heard faint clicking sounds, soft, irregular, almost like insects. But soon the rhythm shifted. The clicks became deliberate, patterned. They echoed off the cliffs, bouncing through the valley in ways that distorted direction and distance. The explorers couldn't tell where the sounds originated or how many sources there were. Some clicks were high and quick, others deep and resonant. They blended into an eerie chorus that made the team feel surrounded. Then came the voices. Not human voices, too breathy, too distant, but unmistakably the sound of something mimicking speech. Word-like murmurs drifted through the trees, repeating syllables that made no sense. One explorer claimed he heard his own name whispered just behind him, though he saw nothing when he turned. Another reported seeing movement near the monoliths, shadows slipping between them, too fast to identify. By midnight, the mist had thickened enough to obscure everything beyond a few meters. The explorers huddled together, flashlights trembling in their hands. The ground continued to hum beneath them, throbbing like a slow heartbeat. At times, it felt as though something massive moved deep beneath the soil. Just before dawn, a scream shattered the valley's silence. One of the explorers had vanished from his sleeping bag, leaving only a deep imprint in the ground and drag-like marks leading toward the circular clearing. The team followed the trail, hearts pounding, until it disappeared near the monoliths. There, they found a single object placed carefully at the base of one pillar, the missing man's compass. It was broken cleanly in half. Panic surged through the group. They decided immediately to leave the valley. But when they reached the crevice, the narrow passageway they had used to enter had inexplicably sealed itself with fallen rock and earth, as though the cliffs had shifted during the night. They were trapped. For 2 days they searched for another exit, moving in widening circles around the valley's perimeter, but every path was blocked by sheer stone walls. All the while, the voices whispered, the clicking grew louder, the ground trembled more frequently. The valley felt alive, awake and watching. On the third night, 2 more members went missing. No screams, no struggle, only an empty space where they had slept and a faint trail of disturbed mist leading toward the monoliths. When the remaining explorers reached the clearing at dawn, they found a new object waiting, a torn scrap of journal paper with 3 words scrawled across it in pencil. "Don't follow us." But the handwriting did not belong to any of the missing. By the 5th day, the valley began to change. The trees seemed to shift positions subtly. The mist grew colder. The monoliths appeared closer together, as if the circle was tightening. The survivors felt dizzy, disoriented, unable to trust their own senses. They realized the valley itself was warping around them. On the 8th day, the last 2 explorers found an opening in the cliff, an exit that had not been there before. Desperate, they fled without looking back, stumbling out into the ordinary sounds of the Amazon, a rush of cicadas, distant bird calls, the hum of life returning. When they later tried to locate the valley again, they failed. The cliffs seemed to have moved. The crevice was gone. The forest floor showed no signs of the path they once followed. It was as though the valley had erased itself after releasing them. Today, the Forbidden Valley remains one of the Amazon's most enduring mysteries. Some believe it is a geological anomaly, a place where magnetic fields distort perception. Others insist it is a spiritual prison designed to contain the remnants of a vanished tribe. A few whisper that the valley still shifts through the forest like a migrating animal, appearing only when it wishes to be found. But those who survived carry the same unshakable memory. Something lives in that valley, something ancient, silent, and aware. There are moments in history when a single survivor becomes the only thread connecting the world to something unimaginable. Sometimes that thread snaps. Other times it frays into tales too unbelievable to accept, too haunting to dismiss. And on rare occasions, it reveals a truth so deeply buried beneath years of silence that it reshapes everything we thought we knew. The story of the last survivor begins with a man known only as Iarao, a quiet, hollow-eyed figure discovered by a river patrol in the late 1970s. He was found wandering along a remote tributary of the Amazon, barefoot, emaciated, and covered in patterns of faded pigment that did not match any known tribe. His hair was woven with thin strands of black fiber, and his eyes held a glare somewhere between animal alertness and human terror. He spoke a fragmented dialect unfamiliar to the patrolman, a broken combination of various tribal languages threaded with strange clicking sounds and melodic hums that none could decipher. It wasn't long before anthropologists realized he might be the last surviving member of a tribe long believed to have vanished, one whose disappearance had been whispered about across generations. But as they tried to communicate with him, they found his mind seemed to drift between the present and something else. He spoke often of shadows, of watchers, of voices beneath the earth. And he carried one memory he refused to let go: the night his people disappeared. When researchers coaxed his story out over weeks and months, they discovered a narrative unlike any disappearance ever recorded in the Amazon's history. Iaro's tribe, which he called the Ohana, had lived in profound isolation for centuries. According to him, they had mastered techniques to remain unseen, using pigments to blend into bark, constructing homes high among the branches, and following a belief system rooted in teachings passed down from ancestors who claimed to have walked between the layers of the world. But something had changed. Something had awakened. It began with tremors beneath the ground, soft vibrations that rippled through the soil like breaths exhaled by the earth. The elders said they had felt such tremors before, in stories of their ancestors, warnings that another realm was pressing against the boundaries of their own. They believed the forest itself was shifting, preparing to reclaim something long lost. Iaro remembered the fear spreading through the tribe like a slow sickness. Hunting routes became dangerous. Paths that had been stable for generations suddenly twisted or vanished. The trees whispered at night, not with wind, but with layered voices that mimicked the living. Children woke screaming, claiming they saw faces in the canopy that did not belong to anyone in the tribe. Elders grew frail and silent, refusing to speak of what they sensed lurking at the edges of the village. And then the forest changed its behavior entirely. One morning, the Ohana awoke to find the entire perimeter of their village lined with spirals drawn in red pigment. The spirals were carved onto tree trunks, painted onto rocks, and even marked across the ground in swirling patterns. No one in the tribe admitted to creating them. The pigment was unlike anything they used, thicker, metallic, and smelling faintly of the earth after lightning strikes.
Shortly after, the disappearances began. A young woman vanished while collecting fruit. A hunter disappeared mid-stride, dropping his spear on the forest floor. A child was taken from his hammock during daylight, surrounded by adults who swore they saw nothing. And with each disappearance, the spirals grew, new ones appearing overnight, larger and deeper, as though carved by invisible hands. Yarao recalled the terror vividly. He described nights filled with clicking sounds that echoed through the canopy, growing louder and more coordinated. Shadows moved where no shadows should exist. Figures appeared briefly at the edge of the firelight, long-limbed, lean, blending with the forest as if they were born from its bark. He said they watched the tribe with patient stillness as though deciding something. One evening, the elders gathered the people and spoke in trembling voices. They claimed the Watchers were the first echoes, ancient beings who once lived beneath the surface of the forest, in caverns that stretched deeper than memory. These beings, according to the Ohana's oldest stories, guarded the boundary between the forest of the living and the world of echoes, a place where lost tribes drifted after being absorbed by the earth. The elders believed that something had caused the barrier to crack, and now the Watchers were returning. Yurao's voice often faltered when he reached this part of the story, but he always described the same event, the night everything ended. The air grew warm and heavy, and the ground trembled. The trees shook as if something massive moved through their roots. Then the clicking stopped abruptly. Silence fell. A silence so solid it pressed against their ears like a weight. A faint humming began, low at first, then rising. The tribe gathered in the center of the village, children crying, adults clutching their tools as though they meant something. The humming grew stronger, vibrating through their bones, and from the trees came shapes, dozens of them, descending like shadows peeling away from the canopy. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the flames. Their bodies bore spirals identical to those around the village, swirling as though alive.
The Ohana panicked, but the Watchers did not attack. They simply circled the tribe, moving with frightening grace. Then the ground beneath the villagers shifted, sinking slightly, as if softening beneath their feet. Yarao felt his legs tremble. He watched in horror as the first villager was pulled downward, not grabbed, not dragged, but drawn into the earth as though gravity changed its direction. One by one, the villagers sank, silently, without struggle, their bodies slipping into the soil as though the forest had opened invisible mouths beneath them. The Watchers hummed louder, guiding the descent, and the spirals around the village glowed faintly. Yarao was young, agile, and terrified. He ran. He fled into the trees, climbing into the canopy the way his elders had taught him. From high above he watched his people vanish, every last one, until only the Watchers remained, staring upward as if they sensed him. He climbed deeper into the forest until exhaustion overcame him. He never saw his tribe again. When researchers heard this story, most dismissed it as trauma-induced memory. Some believed Yarao had witnessed a natural disaster, perhaps a sinkhole swallowing his people. Others theorized violence from an unknown rival tribe, but none of these explanations accounted for the spirals, the Watchers, or the strange pigments painted on Yarao's body when he was found, pigments resistant to weather, water, and chemical degradation, pigments no laboratory could trace to any known source. And there was one more detail. Before Yarao died years later, he whispered something to the anthropologist who had spent the most time with him. His final words were recorded carefully, though the meaning remains debated. He said, "They went below so they could return above." No one knows what he meant. Perhaps his tribe joined the others who vanished into the forest's depths. Perhaps they became like the Watchers, silent, shifting, unseen. Or perhaps they are still there, beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment when the forest hums and the spirals glow once more.
The Amazon has always been a place where history dissolves into myth. Civilizations rise and vanish beneath the weight of vines. Rivers carve new paths, swallowing ancient villages whole. Memories fade into the soil,
and legends take their place. Yet among all the tales whispered under the dense canopy, none are more unsettling or more persistent than the ones claiming that the tribes who disappeared never truly left. They still walk the rainforest, not as ghosts, not as myths, but as something transformed, hidden in the folds of a world that refuses to be fully known. To understand this final chapter of the vanished tribes, one must look not just at the stories themselves, but at the patterns, the smoke that appears without fire, the footprint that ends mid-step, the laughter of children drifting through trees long after their bodies are gone. The Amazon leaves clues like footprints in shifting sand, easily dismissed, yet never fully erased. Modern researchers have tried to explain the disappearances through conventional means. They speak of epidemics, displacement, climate shifts, intertribal warfare, and forced migration. These answers hold weight. History has recorded countless tragedies born from outside intrusion. But such explanations crumble when confronted with the accounts of entire villages vanishing overnight, leaving meals still warm over dying fires. They collapse in the face of the watchers reported across centuries, the spiral markings no one can decipher, the eerie harmony of clicking voices echoing through valleys untouched by humans for generations. Some believe these tribes mastered the art of invisibility, not magical invisibility, but survival invisibility. These theories suggest that after witnessing centuries of violence brought by colonizers, rubber barons, and modern loggers, the tribes retreated deeper into the rainforest, adopting techniques lost to modern people. They moved silently through trees, abandoned predictable paths, erased footprints with woven palm brooms, and built homes high in the canopy where no outsider would ever venture. They learned to camouflage their bodies with pigments designed to mimic bark and shadow, using crushed leaves and oils that broke down under sunlight and rain, leaving no trace behind. This theory, while rational, cannot explain everything. It does not explain the crimson smoke that rose from vanished settlements only to disappear seconds later. It does not explain the perfect circles carved into the forest floor, circles too mathematically precise for any surviving Amazonian tribe to have constructed without tools. It does not explain the humming vibrations reported by explorers across eras, vibrations that seemed to affect the ground, the trees, even the air itself.
Other researchers propose a more spiritual explanation, that the tribes did not vanish in the physical sense, but crossed into another realm, the realm of echoes described in Yarao's final testimony. According to this idea, certain rituals or natural anomalies may open thin points between worlds, allowing those who know the passages to slip through the forest's deepest layers. In this worldview, the Watchers, the Red Smoke people, and the Ohana did not disappear. They evolved into something existing between the boundaries of folklore and physical reality. Such theories mirror the oral traditions of many tribes who still inhabit the forest. These tribes speak of paths that are alive, trails that appear only when the earth wishes them to be found. They talk of valleys that exist only on certain nights, of trees that move their roots when stepped upon, of rivers with memory, of mountains that whisper when approached by outsiders. Most chilling of all, they speak of the ones who walk without sound, humanoid shapes drifting through the canopy, glimpsed only in the corner of a terrified eye. Modern science rejects such notions, yet the evidence refuses to vanish. Satellite images have occasionally captured anomalies, patches of forest in perfect shapes, glowing heat signatures in regions devoid of human life, and sudden changes in vegetation patterns that appear almost deliberate. When teams go to investigate, these anomalies are gone. The forest rearranges itself, hiding whatever secrets it briefly revealed. Technology, usually unchallenged, becomes unreliable in the Amazon. GPS signals distort. Compasses behave erratically, recording devices malfunction without explanation. There is one particular case that has become legendary among field researchers.
Several years ago, an interdisciplinary team captured footage of a humanoid silhouette moving across a canopy ridge at impossible speed. It darted from branch to branch without causing a single leaf to fall. When the researchers trekked toward the area, they found a set of spirals carved in the ground, fresh spirals, untouched by weather. But the most unsettling detail came when they reviewed the footage frame by frame. The figure in the canopy appeared to be painted in dark pigment, its limbs elongated, much like the watchers described centuries earlier. Yet its eyes reflected the camera light in a way no animal eyes would. The footage was never released.
Whether censored, lost, or quietly dismissed, no one knows. Another theory, one whispered among certain anthropologists who spent too much time wandering the deep interior, proposes that the vanished tribes have become one tribe. Over centuries, as disease and invasion decimated local populations, the survivors of multiple groups may have merged, forming a hidden meta-tribe living in areas inaccessible to outsiders. This group could have inherited knowledge passed down from many vanished tribes, giving them unparalleled mastery of the forest. Such a tribe would be capable of moving through the rainforest in near silence, using intelligence, stealth, and tradition to avoid detection. Still, even this theory fails to explain the supernatural elements scattered across the accounts. The humming ground, the tremors beneath villages, the vanishing valleys, and the strange pigments found on bodies that no known plant could produce all point towards something older, stranger, and deeper. And then there is the most terrifying explanation of all, one that collapses the line between folklore and realism entirely. It suggests the forest itself chooses who disappears. This theory views the Amazon as a conscious entity, one that protects certain secrets, devours others, and determines which tribes remain visible to the world. If the forest decided a tribe should vanish, it could do so in countless ways: sinkholes, floods, landslides, toxic gases, earthquakes, animal swarms. But the seamlessness of the disappearances, the lack of bodies, the intact belongings, the trails that end in nothingness, imply something far more deliberate. Not death, not destruction, absorption. The forest takes them in. Some anthropologists point to ecological anomalies, regions where the soil composition changes abruptly, where tree rings show periods of sudden growth or stress, where underground caverns collapse and reform. Others point to the living root networks beneath the forest floor, networks capable of transmitting chemical signals across vast distances. They speculate wildly that these networks may have played a role in the vanishings, pulling tribes physically into the earth over long periods. But such ideas border on the unbelievable. Yet, every now and then, a small detail emerges that reignites these theories.
A footprint left in fresh mud, small, delicate, ending abruptly at a tree trunk. A carving discovered in a remote cave depicting long-limbed figures with hollow eyes. Audio recordings of laughter echoing through the canopy at night. Campsites found empty, tools arranged neatly, food untouched. Spiral markings growing deeper with each season. Individual puzzles that, when placed together, form a picture no one wants to accept. Somewhere in the Amazon, the lost tribes still walk. Not as ghosts, not as memories, but as something that has adapted to the forest in ways modern humans cannot comprehend. Somewhere in that unfathomable expanse, a child's laughter still drifts between the trees. Somewhere, red smoke still rises for a moment before dissolving into the sky. Somewhere, eyes watch from the canopy, following every outsider with patient intent. Somewhere, an ancient humming vibrates through the roots, signaling that the forest is waking again. And somewhere, deep beneath the tangled roots and shifting soil, a final truth waits.
The tribes who vanished did not disappear. They simply stepped where the rest of the world cannot follow.